Okay. So what we learned yesterday is this new thing, this new chiddush that applies to Nazir. The Gemara told us about a man who set up his Naziris, and then he took money and he said, this money should be lekarbanos nizirusai. This money should be for the karbanos of my Naziris. And he didn't specify any specific dollar for any specific carbon, but he did say lekarbanos nizirusai, which the Rishonim told us means that the money to pay for all of the three karbanos that he'll have to bring, the chatas, the oila, and the shlomim, that money will be this money, which means this money will have to provide three karbanos. And then he dies. The halacha is yiplul in the instead of bringing a chatas, an oila, and a shlomim with it, all of the money gets re-allotted. Is that the word for it? It gets re-allotted to the oila only. And that's the Gemara's problem. How could you say that? If we know for sure that there's oila money in here, there's shlomim money in here, and chatas money in here, how could you now divert all the money to the oila? That was how this whole sugya started. So the Gemara said that there's a special chiddush by Nazir, which, according to Rabbi Yochanan, the chiddush is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. There's a special chiddush by Nazir that in this particular circumstance, when we have money that we know for sure is designated to pay for all three karbanos, yet we had not yet specified which of the monies goes to the oila, which of the monies goes to the chatas, and which of the monies goes to the shlomim. But we did specify that this money as a group will cover for all three karbanos. When something like that happens and the person dies, so the karbanos of Naziris are no longer relevant, the halacha is that all that money gets reallotted and gets sent to bringing a carbon oil. It's a gzeres hakosav. It's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. There's no explanation for it. That's what Rabbi Yochanan said. Rish Lakish said the same halacha, but it's not a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. We actually know it from psukim, and the psukim where we knew it from is it says in the pasuk, "Ish ish mibeis Yisrael u'minager b'Yisrael asher yakriv karbanai l'chol nedreim l'chol nedvoisa." And the Rishonim told us that we're talking about somebody who has a package of karbanos because it's nidrehem plural, nidvoisam plural, and all of the karbanos of Naziris, although they're mandatory, but what triggered them was the voluntary choice to accept upon himself Naziris. So the pasuk is referring to a package of karbanos that comes as a unit, and it's b'nedava. The only thing that could refer to would be Naziris, because Naziris is a nedava, because you accepted it upon yourself voluntarily, and it has a package of multiple karbanos. What do you do with that money? Asher yakrivu l'Hashem lo'oila. It's brought as an oila. So it tells us that when you have a package of karbanos, just like we have by Naziris, and for some reason you cannot bring them as their intended carbon, in our case is because the Nazir died, what you do with all the money is you buy a oil. And that's why we don't have a kasha that there's shlomim money mixed in here and there's chatas money mixed in here. The gzeres hakosav is that you spend it on the oil. Then the Gemara said, if it's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, so the directive of the halacha l'Moshe Sinai can be very specific, that it applies only in this specific case. Because the halacha is, what if when I designated money, I didn't just say this money should be for all my karbanos. Rather, I said this $100 bill is for the chatas, and this $100 bill is for the oila, and this $100 bill is for the shlomim. If I did that, and then the Nazir dies, then surely it's not all an oila. There the Mishnah says, is the money that was designated to the chatas, you have to put liyam melech, and then the shlomim and the oila you could bring. B'nedava. Now, if this rule is halacha l'Moshe Sinai, we could say the halacha l'Moshe Sinai came down to say that only when they're all mixed together and it's not clear which is which, only then does it all become an oila. But when they're designated, it cannot become an oila. But if you learn like Rish Lakish, that the makar is the pasuk doesn't say when yes, when not. The pasuk just says that whenever they're mixed together, you bring them as an oila. So even if I had designated specific monies for each specific carbon, maybe that rule should also apply that all of this excess money goes to buy the carbon oil. To that, the Gemara answers is we have a hard rule that we could never move away from, and that is there's a rule of chatois hamesos. When there's one of 5 conditions occur to a carbon chatos, that chatos could never be brought for anything. That animal is just left to die. If there's money for a chatos and it also suffers one of those 5 conditions, we have to treat the money like an animal that's dying. In other words, you put it into the Yam HaMelech, so it disintegrates, and there's never any hana from it, there's no carbon brought from it, it's not transferred at all. And because of that rule, one of the chatois that dies is if it's meis bailov, if the owner of the chatos died. In this case, if the owner of the Nazir died, the chatos, you cannot do anything with it at all, and it just has to be destroyed. And therefore, although the pasuk doesn't exclude a case where everything was mufurash, where each of the monies were identified, we know that the halacha that the pasuk is telling us that you bring it for an oila cannot possibly be referring to a case where it was clear which money was the chatos, because there we have a rule that's not debatable that gets destroyed. The Gemara then taught us that by an osham, under one of these same circumstances, where a chatas would die, an osham you would bring as a carbon oil. That's how that would work. So what are the 5 types of carbonas that we're talking about? Where if it's a chatas, it dies, and if it's an osham, it's brought as an oil. They're remembered using the word visimna. So the vav stands for vlad chatas. If there's a carbon chatas, it's a female animal and it gives birth. What do you do with that vlad? You let it die. Then there's the temuras chatas, if someone made a temur with a carbon chatas. Then there's the mem, which stands for mesu by love, which is exactly our case here. Then there's the nun, which is nischaper by leha. For instance, someone had a carbon chatos and they lost it, so they had to go buy another one, and they were makriv that other one, and then they find the original one. So now it's again excess. And ayin is over shnasa, meaning the animal was delayed in bringing the animal, and the animal was now too old to qualify to be brought as a carbon chatos. So all these 5 things disqualify the chatos, and what you do with it is you destroy it. Not by a chatos, by an osham. Now these 5 conditions, if they occur to an osham, you let them graze until they get a mum, you sell them, and then you bring a carbon oil. So then the Gemara elaborates a little bit on what you do with the osham. And the Gemara tells us that what happens if you have an animal that was an osham and it suffered one of these conditions. So let's say its owner died. So what do you do with the osham? You have to put it out to graze, let it get a mum, sell it, buy another animal, and bring it as a carbon oil. Well, what happens if after you set it out to graze, before it had a mum, you were makriv it as an oila, the animal itself? So if Huda taught us that would be fine. It would be a good oil, it wouldn't be a possible carbon. What does it mean it was set out to graze? In other words, we need some demarcation point from when it's an osham to when it qualifies to be a carbon oil. What is that demarcation point? That is when you set it out to graze. So what does that mean? So the Mefarish says the Gizbar in charge of the carbonas had to have made a declaration. This animal is no longer an osham, it's now set to be grazed. There are other Rishonim who will hold you don't need that declaration. Once it goes out into the meadow, so then it's grazing. And there are those Rishonim who hold Bezdin actually has to paskin on this animal. This is no longer an osham, it now has to be grazed. Most Rishonim learn that these are all dinim of dairaisa, which means midairaisa, if the owner of an osham dies, midairaisa, the osham remains a carbon osham, and the only way to pull off its osham status is to set it out to graze. And midairaisa, l'chatchila, you're supposed to wait until it gets a mum and sell it and buy another animal with it. So you're not even bringing the actual animal that was originally an asham. You're not bringing that as an oila. You're just using it to buy another animal, which will bring as an oila. But you have a special puzzle that says ashamuba v'yasayahei to tell us that if you've already designated it as an animal that's going to graze, and you brought it itself as an oila, that would also be a good carbon oila. That's the most Rishonim learned. Tosfos we learned says that midaraisa, the moment the owner of a carbon ashram dies, that animal itself you can just bring as an oila. And that we mandate that you should let it graze to get a mum to sell it to buy another one is because Chazal never wanted you to be makriv this animal as an oila if it was once an ashram. Even though now that the owner died, midaraisa you could bring it as an oila. The ashram automatically morphs into an oila. Why don't the Rahman want that to happen? Because we're afraid that if people think that you can that karbanos can spontaneously change from an ashram to an oila, what's going to stop somebody who was Nazir, who set up a carbon ashram, and willy-nilly he decides he wants to bring it as an oila? If we allow the same animal to just switch from ashram to oila, like the deraisa is, people will start switching animals even without the death of the owner, even when it's not allowed. So as a takana, they mandated that you should never use the same animal for an oila that was originally supposed to be an ashram. So let it graze and let it get a mum, and the animal that will bring for an oila will not be the same animal. So those were the two shittas in how the ashram works, where it can no longer be brought as an ashram. Well, so that means if you have a carbon shlum, you can decide you want to be an oila, just willy nilly. That's true also, but you can't willy nilly change the carbon around, right? Unless we have a special discussion, let's say by ocean. Okay, so that solves it. Midirash you cannot. Only an ocean if the biome died. Right. Okay, so let's see where. So let's regroup. So we're focusing now on this chiddush la'alacha, that if someone said he took $1,000, he was a Nazir, he took $1,000, he said, Arezu lekarbanos nizirusai, this money should be the money that covers all three of my karbanos, and then he dies. All of this money now you use to buy a carbon oilos nadava, either because of the halacha l'moshe Sinai that Rabbi Yochanan says, or because of the limit from the pasuk that Rish Lakish says. And now we're going to qualify when this applies and when it does not apply. And we're up to the second to the bottom line on Daf Chafei Amud Beis. Amar Mar, halacha hi benazir, there's a halacha l'moshe Sinai that applies exclusively to the karbanos of a Nazir, and only by the karbanos of a Nazir can you reallocate the funds that were originally supposed to be for the chatos and for the shlomim, and you can reallocate them to buy a carbon oil with it. Correct the Gemara of Suleka. Are you telling me this is such an exclusive rule that applies only to Naziris, but in no other place does it apply? But Tanya, we learned Bishar Chayve Kinin Shabbataya Shefrishu Mois Lekinei. The Bryce is referring to the karbanos that are dependent upon a person's financial status. Someone is a mitzayra and he's being retired from being a mitzayra, so he has to bring a carbon chatas. If he cannot afford a carbon chatas and he cannot afford an animal, so then he could bring a bird. He brings a chatas and an oil, two birds. So what if someone went along and bought those two birds, and before he was makrib them, he became wealthy? So, or I should take it, he didn't buy the birds. He set aside money. He set aside $20 to buy the two birds, and now he suddenly became wealthy, and now he wants to use that money to buy an animal. So how do you deal with it? So let's see what the Brasha says. All other places in the Torah where you need to bring a set of birds, something just went wrong. I think I just lost my Gemara. So let me see if I can re-establish that. Oh, back to my troubles again. Okay, here we go. So Frisu Mois Lekanem, they set aside money for their carbon. The halacha is Rata Lahavi ben Chatus Behema Yavi Oilos Behema Yavi. So let's stop and discuss what the case was. So we had one case by Naziris where I said this money should be Lekarbonos Nizirusai. In that case, we said that means the money must be used to buy all of the different karbonos that I need. We also learned that if someone said Harezu lid Nizirusai, this money is for my Naziris, then it doesn't mean that I need to buy all three karbonos with the money. Then what I mean to say is this money will be used for my Naziris in any way I see fit. I could buy three karbonos with the money. I can decide to buy a very expensive oil with the money and add other money to buy the shlomim and chatos. All it means is this money will be used for my Naziris, but it doesn't necessarily tell me exactly in what way. So in a similar case, if someone said, Moyus elu litzarasi, this money should be to pay for my tzaras. That doesn't mean I have to buy both the chatos and the oil from the money. It just means in one way or another, I have to use this money to be part of the process that discharges my tzaras. So if someone just said, Harejul tzaraisi, Allah is Ratza Lahavi ben Chatos Behema Yavi. If he wants to bring a Chatos Behema rather than the carbon of a bird for a Chatos and a bird for Oila, he can use it to buy an animal, which is the carbon Ashir. He could do that. Or Oilos Behema Yavi. He could even use it to buy an Oilos Behema. In other words, that designation is a very general designation. But mace, and the Rishonim tell us that mace isn't just saying in the same case that we've been discussing until now, what happens if he dies? Because then the Judah says that mace, yipsul nadava. It doesn't say that. It says mace v'hayulei mois asumin. So clearly the Mishnah or the Brisa is now referring to a different case, not the same case as before. And the v'hayulei mois asumin must mean where he said, hareizu, this money should be lekarbanos tzaraiti, for the karbanos of my tzaras. Now that means that this money needs to be used to buy all of the karbanos. I can't add any other money to this to buy something else, which means I now have to buy a chatos and an oila from this money, but now the person died. So you have the money of a chatos and the money of an oila mixed together. We know when that happens, you have to be moedach everything to Yam HaMelech. You can't use that money. It was only Naziris that had an exception because of the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Yet this brisa says yiplu l'nedava. All the money here also goes to l'nedava. So you just told me that there's an exclusive halacha l'Moshe Sinai that applies to Naziris, where when you have money mixed together of the chatas and the oila and the shlamim, it all goes to oila, but nowhere else. I'm showing you that even by a mitzvah, it has exactly the same rule. There was money that was stam, which means part of it has to be used to the chatos, and part of it has to be used to pay for the oila. The man died, and the Brisa says yiplu nedava. Zok to Gemara, you're right. It's not exclusive to Naziris. Tana Nazir v'chai v'kinin dedamule. This rule that we said that when you have the stam money mixed together, you buy an oila with it. It does not apply exclusively to Naziris. It applies to any case similar to Naziris. And Taras, where someone has to bring an oila and a chatas bird, is also similar. What is the similarity? The similarity is any package of karbonos that becomes mandated because of a certain condition. So in the case of Naziris, it's a package of chatas, oila, and shlamim. That package is mandated because he was makabel Naziris. Or Taras, where you also have a package of karbonos. You have a chatas and an oila that's also mandated. Two karbonos are mandated. This package was mandated by a single cause. By Taras, they all have this same rule. So where will this rule not apply? Zok the Heilige Mishnah, Zok the Heilige Gemara, ulafuke mehadatanya. You know where it won't apply? It won't apply when the two karbonos are not part of a package. They're two independent karbonos that this person on his own tried to package together. For instance, somebody was Machal Shabbos b'shoigeg, and because of that, he became a chuyiv in a carbon chatas. Then on his own, nothing to do with his chiyuv chatas, and nothing to do with his avera, v'amar harei alai oila. He decided to accept upon himself to donate a carbon oila. So now this man has a chiyuv to bring two karbanos. He has a chiyuv to bring chatas, which stems from his avera of being Mechal Shabbos, and he has a chiyuv to bring an oila that stems from his Kabbalah. The two chiyuvim are in no way related. And then what did this person do? The hifrish mois v'amar harei elu l'chayvasi. He set aside money, and he said, this money should take care of my chiyuvim, meaning my oila and my chatas. So what is the halacha? If he wants to use this money to buy a chatas behema, he cannot. And if he wants to bring an oila from him, he can't, because he has money that's partially designated to a chatas and that's partially designated to an oila, and he doesn't know exactly which money is connected to what because he didn't specify. So he has money that's in limbo. So Tosfos tells us, how do you get out of this mess? You take two animals and you say to one animal, whatever money in this bundle of money that's right now in confusion, whatever is supposed to be chatas, I want the kedusha from that money to go on to animal A. And whatever money was designated to be oila from this money should be chal on animal B. So now the money becomes chulin, and he has clearly identified which animal is going to be the chatos and which animal is going to be the oila. That's how he would get out of this mess. But what if he died? The hayuloi mois sasumin, and he had again this money that was in limbo. Yechul Yamamelech. There it goes Yamamelech. He has no way out of this. Here you don't say that Yipul Nidava. And the reason for it is because in this case, the Chiyuv is coming from a different place. The Chiyuv to the Oila comes from his Nidava, and the Chiyuv for the Chatas came from his Avera. They're not part of the package. So this clearly illustrates where this Gzeres HaKosev, this Halacha L'Moshe Sinai, applies, when all of the karbanis in the mix are triggered by one condition, and it does not apply when the two chiyuvim are independent chiyuvim that don't really have a connection with each other. But Tosfos has a very important kasha, and let's look at Tosfos halfway down in the thinnest lines of Tosfos. Tosfos says, "Lo yirata lahavi b'chulon chatas behema." So he has money, and he said, this money should pay for my chiyuvim. He cannot use the money for a chatos, and he cannot use the money for an oil. So before we learn this Tosfos, I want to remind ourselves and chazer over the three different scenarios by Kabbalah's carbon for Nazirs. The first scenario that we learned was when someone set aside money and he said, Harei elu l'nazirois. These should be for my Nazirs. And we said there, the halacha is that he can use all the money to buy any one of the karbanis and then add money to it. Why? Because when someone says Harei elu l'nazirusi, it doesn't mean that this money is going to pay for all of my karbanis. It just means that I'm going to use this money to help with my Nazirs. But I can use it in any way I see. That was category A. Category B was he said, the karbanos nazirusai. There we say that means that the money must be used to pay for all three karbanos. So now you have money that has to pay for all three karbanos, and we don't know which dollar goes to which carbon. So there we said, if he dies in that confusion, all of the money goes to an oila because of the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. If he's alive and that happens, well, then he's going to have to take animals and say whichever part of this money was for chatat should be on this animal, whichever part of the money was for oila goes to this animal, whichever part of the money goes to shlam is for this animal. Then we had a third level when I said this $100 is for chatos, this $100 is for shlamim, this $100 is for oila. Then I use each one for their respective carbon, and if they get mixed together, I have to be moilech everything to Yamamelech because I can't use anything. Those were the three categories that we had. So now let's see how they apply to this case where a fellow had two independent chiyuvim one for his chatas, one for his oila. Zokt the brisa. Here he cannot. Now what do you say? When if I would ask you l'chayvasi to you, which of the three categories should you compare it to? To the case where I said harelu niziraisai, where I can do whatever I want with the money, or is it like harelu harezu lekarbanas nizirusai, where I need to buy all three karbanas out of that money, or is it like I really specified what's for what? What would you say? Would it be category A, B, or C? The first case was in Nazirus was I said Hare Elu l'Nazirusam. Hare Elu l'Chayvasi. I just said this money should be for my obligations. I would compare it to case A, right? Which means I should be able to use it for whatever I want. Yet the Brisa says you cannot. So it's a similar expression, Hare Elu l'Nazirusai. And by Nazirus, we know you could do whatever you want with the money. Yet the Brisa here says you can't. You have money here of Oila and of Chatas here. The Ein Loy Takana, and the only way out is Achayavi Beis Behemais. He has to bring two animals. The Yomer Kol Mashiyesh B'Mois Elu should go L'Kdushas Chatas, should go on the Chatas. And Kol Mashiyesh B'Mois Elu for the Oila should go on this Oila. The problem is why? The Tarachian. The Maishna. What's the difference between the case of Nazirus, the La'il Gabi Hivrish Mois, and he just said Hare Elu L'Nzuroisai, which is similar to Hare Elu L'Chayvaisai, and what is the halacha there? You could do whatever you want. We don't say that the money had to be used to buy both karbanos. You could do whatever you want. I'm sorry. So this case that we're referring to was the case of the birds. When he said this is for my tzaras. And the same thing going back 2 cases ago to the case of Nazirus. The Gemara said that since I just said not the karbanis Naziraisai, it just means I'm going to use it for my Nazirus, but I can use this money to buy only the Shlomim and add the other money to buy the other karbanis. So why is this different? Why is Harei Chayvasi different than Harei Naziraisai? So Tosfos has 2 pshat. The Shemiyesh Loimar, and this is a pshat that Tosfos is telling us the way it is, whether we like it or accept it or not, we can't argue. The word l'chayvasi has a different connotation than if I would have said l'niziraisai. Because l'chayvasi is mashma l'chol masha huchay. When I say l'chayvasi, the connotation of that is it will completely pay off all of the karbanos that are owed. Not like niziraisai. So hilchach, hafrasha haisa l'shneim, this money was designated, you have to buy 2 karbanos with it, both the chatas and the oila. And therefore, when I say this money should be for my naziris, I say this money should be for my tzaras, mashma shaper lemiktas nazirusai or lemiktas tzaraita. So Tosfos is telling us that's how the language is understood. We can't comment on what people meant when they said things back in Tosfos' times. So therefore, we just have to accept it for what it is. That chayvasi has a connotation that I'm going to buy all my karbanos with it, and the Naziraisai does not. Gewaltig. Zok the Gemara, v'oid yesh l'chalik. There's also another option here, and this is an ingenious thought of Tosfos. There's a massive difference between 2 independent karbanos, like we're talking about now, and karbanos that come from the same point of chiyuv, from the naziris, from the tzaras. There's also they come from the same point. So therefore, it's not such a wild misappropriation of funds if I take money that was supposed to be for the oil of Naziris and I apply it to the shlomim of Naziris. You know why? Because even the shlomim of Naziris was for Naziris. So it's not such a misappropriation. And the same by Tzaras, because all of the karbanos in the group in this package are coming for the same reason. Therefore, when this person who originally set aside money for the 2 birds, he became wealthy, what he could do is he can change and maybe michulan oy chatas oy oila, because he's not really misappropriating it because he's still designating it to a carbon related to his taras. Aval hacha de mechuyev chatos mechelev she'achal. The chiyuv chatos comes from one area, from chelev she'achal. The oila. Oh, my screen is not lining up to my movement. The oila nedura, and the oila is coming from a completely separate chiyuv. It's nedura lav nechad baktinim. So the way I look at it is, the Nazir carbon is like a TV dinner. You have a whole bunch of compartments. So you move the potatoes into the vegetables, you move the vegetables into the protein. But it's still all one big pot. Mashenkin, if I have one dish with chatas chelim in it, and I have a completely different dish with the dava and oila, those dishes you can't mix. If I set aside money for this chatas and this oila that are two completely separate karbanos, I cannot misapply the funds. So that's Kaiser's as far as why, when you have two different karbanos, it's more strict in whether or not you're allowed to use the funds of one for the other. When all of the chiyuvim, even though they're different types of karbanos, but when their chiyuv are coming from the same place, then you'd be allowed to reallot what the money was for. No, because it applies not only to Nazir. We already said that it's Nazir and everything that's similar to it, right? So we've expanded it. So this is not similar because this is not coming from the same chiyuv. Exactly. So now we've learned one piece of information about the rule. The rule doesn't only apply to Naziris. The rule applies to anything where the multiple karbanos that are in this mixture of money are all mechuyev from the same source. Okay, so that's one piece of information we learned about this rule, and now we're going to learn some additional information about this rule and when it applies and when it doesn't. Amar Abashi had amit mefaroshin lo. So we said that the category that this rule applies to, if you said to a bunch of money, you didn't specify which dollars for what. If the person dies, all of that goes on the dava, you buy an oil with it all. But if I took 3 piles of money, and each pile I said, this pile is for the chatos, this is for the oil, this is for the shlamim, that's mefurish. Then if they got mixed together, you have to send all the money to Liyam HaMelech, because it might be a standalone chatos, and the standalone chatos you surely cannot buy with it oil money. You can't buy an oil with it. So Rav Ashi drills down a little bit to give us clarity in the line between these two categories. So Amar Rav Ashi, had amit mefurashin loy tema. Don't say what I just said, that it was really explicit in how I separated it. Damar elu chatasi, this pile of money is for chatos. The elu loylasi, this pile of money is for my oila. The elu shlami, this pile of money is for my shlamim. You didn't have to be that specific that it should be considered mefayrash not to allow you to buy an oila with all of the money. Elafilu amar, even if you said about one big pile, elu lechatasi uleoilasi uleshlami, uleshalmi mefurashin, that's good enough of a specific identification where you would no longer be able to apply the halacha l'Moshe Sinai to give all the money and buy a carbon oil with it because you were too specific. That's called the mufurish. So that's a pretty big chumrah, because we're saying even if I didn't identify which money in the pile is for the chatas nashim, I just said each one individually as I was makdish the whole pile of money. That's good enough not to allow it all to be brought as an item. And the Ikadarmi goes a step further. If it's mixed together and you don't know what's what, you have to put the whole thing Liyam HaMelech. Everything gets ruined. That's what I know. If you're alive, you could. But if the Nazir had died, so then you can't do anything with the chatas. If the Nazir is alive and he does that, yeah, he'll take 3 animals and he'll say the chatas money should go here, the oil money should go on this animal, and the shlam money should go on that animal. But if he's not alive and the chatas is no longer bringable, so then the whole thing goes into the garbage. You can't do that anymore because there's money in there of chatas hameis. There's money in this pot that has to be destroyed, and we don't know which money it is.
$90. Yeah,
So you want to bring up a very big chiddush. We know that you could transfer kedusha from money to an animal. You want to suggest that I could transfer isur hana of money that I can't use for anything. I could transfer that onto an animal. So you're suggesting take the money that was designated for the chatos, put it onto this animal, and then let this animal die, and then let this animal die, right? And then do the money. That's a new chiddush that you don't find anywhere. We know that you could be paid the kachim, you could be paid the hektish. Now you want to make a new thing that I could be paid the isur hana. There's no source for something like that. Yeah, there's no makar like that. So Zog the Gemara. So Rabashi makes it even more stringent. Amar Rabashi, loy tema ad amar elul chatasi lalashi wasami. That for sure is considered mufurash. But even something more subtle, elafilu amar elul lechayvasi. Even if I said on this money, this should be for my chiyuv of Naziris, hareyan kemufurash. So this line is very, very, very shver, because we just learned at the top of the Amud that the reason why, in the case of a fellow who had an independent chatas and an independent oila, the reason why we don't use this rule and we say he has to bring two separate karbanas is because he said Eilu l'chayvasi. And Tosfos even told us that l'chayvasi has a connotation of mefurish. And now we're saying that by Naziris, it would have the same rule. So the Gemara on top of the Amud wanted to say, where does the special rule of Naziris not apply? It applies if someone had a chiyuv to bring a chatas and a chiyuv to bring an oila. And he said, there it doesn't apply. Well, guess what? That's not special because it's not Naziris. Under the same circumstances, by Naziris as well, if you said Eilu l'chayvasi, you wouldn't apply. That is Tosfos' kasha. So Tosfos says, okay, according to this Rabashi, you have a problem with the earlier Gemara. But according to the first Rabashi, Eilu l'chayvasi maybe would be fine for Naziris, but it wouldn't be fine for two separate karbanos. So according to the first Rabashi, that works perfectly with the Gemara on top. According to the second Rabashi, we have a massive problem because the Gemara up on top said Eilu l'chayvasi is not a problem by Naziris. It's only a problem by other types of karbanos where they're not related. And here it's saying even by Naziris, you'd have the same problem. Zog Tosfos, a wonderful pshat. The Gemara up on top is trying to tell you what would apply to Naziris and what would apply to Naziris but would not apply to other karbanos. And in fact, the Eilu l'chayvasi is the same for Naziris and other karbanos. So what is the distinction that the Gemara is trying to make about what applies to Naziris but does not apply to everything else? Zog Tosfos, let's look at the Brisa again. The Tanya, Misha ayu mechuyev chatas, v'amar arei alai oila, v'ifrish moyos, v'amar arei l'chayvasi, rotza lavi ben chatas bein lo yavi, oilus bein lo yavi. And in fact, as the Gemara said later, with Naziris it would be exactly the same thing. That's not where we're trying to highlight a difference between Naziris and other karbanos, because as we just said from Rabashi, it's the same thing. But the second case, meis v'hayulai mois asumin, where I didn't say l'chayvasi. In a case where I didn't say l'chayvasi, it was just mois asumin. I just said harei elu l'karbanoitai. I didn't use the word l'chayvasi. There, yalchul yamamelech by two individual karbanos, as in the case of this brisa, but by Naziris, under the same circumstances, you would be able to apply everything to a karban oila. So the distinction that the Gemara is trying to make between Naziris and other places is not referring to the Reisha of the brisa, it's referring to the Seif of the brisa, where you didn't use l'chayvasi. Because the moment you use l'chayvasi, it puts Naziris and every other case into the same chiyuv. Okay, beautiful. So that's the first thing we learned, that mefurish doesn't necessarily mean literally designating each pile of money. Even something as general of Eilu l'chayvasi would be considered mefurish, where you could no longer buy with all the money a karban oila. I know this is a little complicated and dry because it's kachim, but we're going to be finished this kachim gemara and we're going to get back into Naziris very soon. We just have another blot to get through. Amar Rava. Rava said, Now he wants to make another qualification. When do we say Moish assuming Yiplu Dava? So the case that we have in our mind is if you have chatos, oila, and shlomim, money mixed together. Zokt Rava, that's only if you have the chatos in the mix. There has to be chatos in the mix. But what happens if naflo de mechatos mi b'neim? What if we were able to separate the mechatos? For instance, the Gemara is going to tell us, someone said this $100 should be for the chatos, and the rest of the money should be for the rest of their karbanos. So their chatos is no longer in the mix. You just have the rest of the money. Zokt Rava hare hein kemufurash. They're like mufurish. In other words, this gzeres hakasur, this very specific halacha l'moshe Mishinai, tells us that the only time we say everything goes l'nedava is if there's a chatas here in the mix. If there's no chatas in the mix, all bets are off, and you don't say everything goes l'nedava. So if it's a halacha l'moshe Mishinai, it's very simple to understand. The halacha l'moshe Mishinai could be as specific and as discriminating as it wants to be, and they could pinpoint when this is halacha said. But let's not forget, Rish Lakish just learned this whole thing from a very general pasuk, right? Rish Lakish learned it from the pasuk that says, "Asher Yaakov karbani l'chol l'dreim l'chol l'dvaisam, asher kivil Hashem lo'ila." Does it say anywhere in this pasuk that the mixture has to have a chatos in it? It says any multiple chiyuv carbon has this rule. So where in the world does Rish Lakish see in this pasuk that this only applies if there's a chatos involved? Zok Tosh is an unbelievable thing. You never find by any carbon that you could misappropriate funds. You could reallocate funds from one carbon to another carbon. For instance, I said I alai oila, and I put down $100 to buy the carbon, and I ended up finding the carbon for $50. What do you do with the extra $50? All you could do is buy another oila. Can't do anything else with the money. There's only one exception to that rule, and that is a chatos. If someone is mechuyev a chatos and he puts aside $100, this is for my chatos, and he ends up buying a chatos for $50, you know what you do with the extra $50? You buy an oila with it. So the chatos is the only carbon that we had that already has a precedent of misappropriation. I mean, misappropriation is not the right word because it's halacha. It's reallocation. The chatos is the only animal that we see elsewhere has a precedence of reallocation. So therefore, if you have a pasuk telling us reallocation works when they're mixed together, it's logical to apply that primarily to a carbon chatos where you already see this characteristic. So therefore, Zok Rava, an unbelievable chiddush, that this whole rule that we have, that when these karbanos are mixed together, you buy an oil with it, that's only if there's a chatos in the mix, which is a chiddush because you're making it into an oila. You would think if an oila and a shlamim, okay, they're both in davish, you can put them together. No, an oila and shlamim you wouldn't be able to put together, only if there's a chatos in the mix. So either chatos oila and shlamim, or chatos and oila, or chatos and shlamim. But chatos has to be one of the two karbanos in order to allow everything to go in the double. Tanya Kavasei the Rava. We actually have a brisa that supports what Rava says. The brisa says, Elu lechatasi. If someone designated this money is exclusive for the chatos, Bashar and the rest of the money, Lishar Nizir Roisai, should be for the other chiyuvim of my Naziris, such as the shlamim and the oila. So the halacha is, if the person dies, the mechatos yelchu liyam melech. Bashar, not yiplu l'nedava, rather yabi chetze la'oila, v'chetze l'shlamim. Which means that trick, you have to take two animals and say whatever in this pile of money is oila should go on this animal, whatever in this money is shlamim should go on that animal. You have money that's half shlamim and half oila. Now the halacha is, if you have enough from a carbon shlamim, there is no din me'ila on it. But if you have enough from a oila, there is a din me'ila. Zokt, the brisa, since half the money is shlamim, if you only have enough from 45% of the money, that might all be shlamim. You might have no chiyuv to do anything for me'ila, unless you benefited from at least 51% of the money, where you know for sure you benefited from the money that was designated to be the carbon oila. There's no din me'ila. So when it says it means you're only moil if you for sure we're moil in both karbanis, which Toshu says means 51% of the money. If you had a naw from less than 50% of the money, or 50 or less, then we don't know for sure that you had a naw from the money that was designated to be an oila, there would be no denila. What if someone said elu la'ilasi? So he broke out the oila, v'ashar l'shar niziroisai, which then mixes the chatos and the shlamim together. So again, the me'oila yaviu oila, umay alin bahen, because there's me'ila on the oila, v'ashar yiplul l'nedava. Since there's chatos and shlamim mixed together, all the money goes, not the chatos, not the shlamim, but halacha l'moshe Sinai tells us that it goes for an oila. And the same rule applies. Since half is shlamim and half is chatos, you need to be moil in 51% of the money, so then we're sure you were moil on the chatos. What's difficult with this is, we just said a second ago that since these two are mixed together, what do you bring with them? An oila. So technically, all the money is oila money. So if all the money is oila money, why aren't you moil even the miktasan? Why don't you need 51%? 100% of this money is oila. Zog says a massive chiddush that even though we say that all the money goes to the dava, until they actually shech the carbon, the money is still 50% shlamim, 50% oila. It doesn't become, 50% shlamim, 50% chatos. It doesn't become an oila when you say the ipul dava until the last second. So the money remains in the status quo. Only at the end, at the last second, does it change over to be money of oila. So that's another qualification we learned. So we learned about mafurish. Mafurish is, even if someone's a chaybasi, we learned the rule of Rava, that this rule that any mixture is yipul nedava is only if there's a chatos in the mix. Now we're going to learn another rule. Amar Fun Amarav, lo yishanu elamois. This that we say that when there's a mixture, it all goes to the nedava. That's only if it was cash. Aval behema. What if you have three animals? Hareyu kemifuresh. That's mifuresh. And Tosfos tells us, what are you thinking? Without a doubt, you're thinking you have three animals, so of course it's mifureshes, because each animal is going to be designated as one of the carbon. Animal A will be chatas, animal B will be oila, and animal C will be shlamim. Zok Tosfos, that's not at all what it is. Oh, Zok Tosfos, right? So it's obvious. So that's obvious. That's mifureshes. Zok Tosfos, that's not what the Gemara means. What if I have three animals that are not roy to be a chatas? I have three animals that are not roy to be an oila. That's also mifureshes. If you have animals, if you have only one animal to roy to be a chatas, well, of course it's mifureshes. It's obvious. This is the only one. Zok Tosfos, even if none of them could be a chata, or none of them could be an oila, or none of them could be a shlamim, it's still mifureshes. Why? We're going to see in a minute. Even if they're three elephants, although elephants aren't a good example. Amar Rab Nachman said, Had Ami Behema Hareu Kemifureshes. Now that we're saying that a behema is like mifureshes, Lo Shanu El Tamima. It only is the animal that's a tamim, Aval Bala Samum, but if it's a Bala Samum, Hareu Kisasuma. So this is perplexing. What in the world could be the reason for this? And what should it make a difference if it's a tam or a balmum? Either way, I got to sell this animal to buy an animal that will be appropriate for the carbon that we're trying to use it for. Zok Tosfos very beautifully. If these animals were balamum, so you could instantly sell them and buy what you need to buy. But if they're tamim, what do you need to do? Tosfos says even though you designated an animal, let's say I took an animal that was not a female, it was a male, and I said, this is for my chatos, even though you can't bring it as a chatos, it does take on kedushas aguf, because this animal could be a carbon, although a different type of carbon. And since it takes on the kedushas aguf, you can't just sell it and buy what you need. You need to wait till it gets a mum. Zok Tosfos, since these animals all cannot be instantly cashed in to buy the animal that you need, rather there's going to be a time delay. It could take weeks, it could take months till one of them develop a mum. We're afraid that in that span of time, you're going to designate one of these animals to a chatas, one of these animals to an oila, and one of these animals to a shlamim, and we're not going to know which is which. So because of that, this rule that it's kistuma is only where we don't need to be concerned that you actually went and designated to them. So therefore, Animals that are tamimim are like mefureshes. You know why? Because we're afraid that during the period of time you needed to wait, you might have designated animals to specific causes. But if it's a balas mum, then you're not going to designate the animal it's a balas mum, because in a minute you're going to sell it and buy the right animal, and then you'll designate it. So therefore, if it's a balas mum, we're not concerned. We look at it like cash, that you're not going to designate anything until you actually buy the animal that you're planning to use as a carbon. What about an aval nascha? A nascha is not like a stuma. A nascha is a piece of gold. A piece of gold is something, if you have 3 pieces of gold, once again, you're not going to just sell it. You're going to want to make sure to get the best price for it. It's not something that's like a grocery. It's something that's valuable, it's specialized, and you're going to want to make sure to get the right amount. I'm sure it doesn't mean a gold bar with a specific weight and a specific value. It probably is something that's subject to negotiation, speculation. You have to advertise it on eBay, on Amazon, on websites to get it going. So therefore, it's something that there's going to be some time delay between now and when we'll actually have the animals to designate. So once again, we're afraid that Balaam might have designated this piece of gold for this animal, this for the other animal, and therefore we cannot treat it like a susuma. Nascha is not so specialized. That can be liquidated quickly, and we don't need to worry that in that period of time, until they liquidate it and buy the animal, that the person will designate it. But what if you had building materials? You had boards. Those were much harder to come by, and therefore they're much more specialized. And they definitely take a long time to liquidate till you could negotiate with somebody to get your best price. There, we're concerned that in the meantime, you're going to designate this pile of wood for this carbon, that for that carbon, and therefore, Lloyd, we don't treat it like susuma. Okay, so now we look at a new concept. The new concept is that when whatever you have, there's going to be a time delay between now and when you're going to be able to actually designate them. We're afraid you might designate them prematurely. You might pull the trigger too quickly, and then we can no longer say everything should be an oila. So my tamayu de rabbanon. What is as far as the rabbanon? The army mois v'loy behema, money is stama, a behema is not, or v'loy nascha, or a piece of gold is not, or mois v'loy sabra, money is suma, but not building materials. If that's his svara, if that's the svara, elamayata mois v'loy oifais. What happens if someone is mechuyev to bring 2 oifais? Echaz la'oila, v'echaz la'chatas. And he buys the birds. Are you going to tell me that once again they have a din of mefureshes, which means if he buys birds and then there's a delay, are you going to tell me that we can no longer know what's a chatas and what's an oila because maybe he designated them and we don't know which is which? And if you're going to tell me, yeah, if you had 2 birds, you'd have that problem, I'm going to prove to you that there's no such problem. Chista taught us a very important halacha. When you're mechuyev to bring 2 birds, echas la'oila v'echas l'chatas, you cannot designate them at any given point as to what should be the oila and what should be the chatas. There's only 2 points in time where they can be designated. At the time of the purchase, when the bailam goes to the dealer and buys the 2 birds, at that moment he has the ability to designate which will be the chatas, which will be the oila. If he doesn't at that time, he could no longer designate them at all. Or ibasiyas koid. Then what happens? He has 2 birds that are not designated. You know who's going to designate them? The kohen when he shechs them. Frank the Gemara, why is that? Am I hamois gemirn law? Did you not teach us that only money, which you could do right away without a delay, there we say is tama, but everything else we would say I might have designated. So how in the world could you tell me that there's no concern here with the kohen? I'm going to stop here because this really, as you can see from tomorrow's daf, opens up a massive, complicated sugya. So I don't want to get into it now. We'll do it tomorrow, and we'll get into this issue with the birds. In the meantime, today we just learned a whole bunch of important qualifications of this halacha l'mashimashinai. We learned that it not only applies to Nazirs, it applies to anything where all of the karbanas come from one root. We learned that Stam and Mefurish isn't as simple as it seems, because even if you said Eilu L'chayvasi, that's called Mefurish. And we also learned that the chatos has to be in the mix. And we also learned that items that take a long time to process, we're concerned that in the meantime, the owner did designate which item should be for which carbon. Okay, and with that we will stop. And we should be a good tavach.
Go ahead.
And we're gonna get out of this mess soon.
Thank God.
Yitvach, Shkoyach.
No.
Okay.